Now then, how are you doing? I hope you're well. Learning to paint in watercolour can be a confusing business. If you read through any number of books by different artists or watch multiple demonstrations online, and who doesn't, then the likelihood is that you'll end up with conflicting information. For example, artists don't always agree on colours, so be prepared to experiment a little yourself to find which ones suit you. Well, don't be bullied into buying a colour if you really don't like it. An artist's palette is a very personal thing, and there's no such thing as a definitive set of colours. So, in this episode, I'm going to run through a few home truths, bash out a smattering of useful terms, and throw a quick painting together for you in the hope that it may help you in your first teetering steps along your watercolour journey. So I'm going to assume you've already unpacked your newly acquired paints and brushes, mixed some colours up and thrown them at the paper to see what happens. Here's a question though. Did your paper cockle and bend out of shape, basically become unusable? If it did, are you sure you're using watercolour paper? It might seem like a daft question, but watercolour paper is specifically designed for the job, and I wouldn't recommend using anything else. Well, having said that, even watercolour paper, particularly if it's lightweight and probably cheap, is susceptible to cockling. It happens because it's soaked up the water and expanded. The way to reduce the likelihood of that happening is to buy heavier paper. Well, £200 or heavier is good, or if you're on a tight budget, then you should soak it in water, tape it to your board with gum tape and leave it to dry. We call that process stretching your paper. When you're done, it should be as flat as a pancake and a dream to paint on. Applying paint to paper is pretty straightforward. If you're aiming for a flat, consistent finish, we call that a plain wash. If you want the paint to graduate either from a dark tone to a light tone, for example, or from one colour to another, we call that a graded wash. Well, if you're applying paint to dry paper, it's commonly described as wet on dry, while applying multiple colours to a wet or damp surface is often referred to as wet in wet. At which point it's worth reminding you that watercolour is a transparent medium, a property that we should endeavour to exploit as often as possible. When a wash has dried, it's okay to apply further washes on top of it. If you can see the earlier colours showing through the new layer, that new layer could be described as a transparent wash. Here then is a simple example of those basic washes in action. My wet in wet wash is produced by applying cadmium yellow, cadmium red and French ultramarine to a sheet of paper that I've pre-wet with clean water. In watercolour, timing is crucial, never more so in fact than when you're trying to paint a wet in wet wash. If it starts drying out before you get to the last colour, you may end up with unsightly hard lines, or worse. You'll notice that I'm graduating it in such a way as to try and create the illusion of a glow coming from the left-hand side somewhere. It's a combination of colours that I find works well for me and is one that I use quite regularly for sunsets and sunrises. And to really put the things I've been talking about to the test, let's build this up using a series of multiple washes, all laid on top of each other and, most importantly of all, light enough to allow the previous washes to show through. As a general rule, it pays to recycle colours because it helps to create an underlying theme, not to mention promoting harmony and cohesion. So there are lots of different washes, all referred to by different names, but if you don't remember any of them, does it really matter? Of course not. Mix your paint up, throw it onto some paper and enjoy yourself with it. That's the reason we do it after all. Well, just a quick heads up though. If you're completely new to watercolour, then getting the right balance of paint to water in your mix is going to take some getting used to. Water is a natural, generally untamable substance with a mind of its own, and it will often feel like it's conspiring against you. It's okay to be paranoid. It happens to us all. If there's too much excess water present, then you're likely to encounter a backrun or two. What's a backrun, I hear you ask? Well, it looks something like this. Dreadful, right? Well, not necessarily. It can be a force for good. For one thing, they tend to happen randomly, and generating the random element is surprisingly one of the hardest things we have to do in watercolour. In fact, with a little care and ingenuity, a backrun can be turned into something good. This is Dunstanburgh Castle on the northeast coast of England. The castle makes for a great skyline, and the cotton grass provides us with an interesting foreground. Well, that warm glow in the sky should be looking familiar by now. Needless to say, this calls for one of those wet in wet washes. That will be cadmium yellow, cadmium red and French ultramarine then. I'm reclaiming a smattering of random highlights for the cotton grass by dabbing them out with a piece of scrunched up tissue. A couple of deliberately generated backruns help to add to the general texture. Which brings me to the castle, and to try and reinforce that glow, I'm painting it in with a cadmium red that slowly graduates to French ultramarine. Hopefully you can see how effective it is and how it produces a more visually interesting result than just simply painting it in with a single colour. Well, to create a little variation to the middle ground, I'm again using cadmium red and French ultramarine and then relifting out the highlights while it's still damp. Well, finally, to complete the cotton grass, I'm mixing up a dark, rich colour from French ultramarine and burnt umber. And it doesn't take much to create the impression that I'm looking for. All I have to do is drop a small amount of dark tone at the base of the flower head and then soften it off upwards with a damp brush. For the stems and long grasses, I've mixed up a green from cadmium yellow, Prussian blue and burnt umber. To complete the foreground chaos, I'm scratching out a smattering of highlights with a craft knife. Well, I hope some of that may have been useful to you. All paintings, no matter how complex, once you know what you're looking for, can be deconstructed and broken down into those basic washes. Always remember, we work from light to dark and that watercolour is a transparent medium. So, We should try to use that to our advantage. Also, graduations and variations in tone and colour make a scene more interesting. I'm going to be back with more watercolour basics very soon, so if you've enjoyed this video, please do hit the like button, and if you've not already done so, please consider subscribing to my channel. More in-depth guidance and advice is of course available through my online tuition service. Details of how to subscribe to that are in the description below. In the meantime, keep watching what happens on the paper and enjoy. Until the next time, take care.